Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with Chapter 9 of Adventures in Book Collecting by William Harris Arnold. And this chapter is on Robert Louis Stevenson. It's titled My Stevensons. In Edinburgh, a few years before the Great War, while chatting with a Scot with whom I had a bookish acquaintance, I made an allusion to Robert Louis Stevenson. "Would you like to meet Cummie?" said my companion. I eagerly assented. A few hours later, bearing a letter of introduction, my wife and I rang Alison Cunningham's doorbell. The old nurse gave us a glad greeting. She said she liked Americans. Conversation was difficult. Cummie was stone deaf, so that what we wished to say had to be written. Soon, in response to our messages, she became delightfully voluble. One of the reminiscences of her dear boy was that, at a time when he had been very, very naughty, Mrs. Stevenson gave directions to have him stand in a corner of the room. After half an hour, Cummie successfully interceded for pardon. On telling Louis to come to her, he said, "Shh, shh, don't talk to me, I'm telling myself a story." Another tale was of the delicate child waking in the night after frightful dreams. He would cry, "Give me the Bible, give me the Bible." But with the coming of dawn, his call was, "Give me the novel, give me the novel." Time and again, the rigors of the Edinburgh winter impelled the boy's mother to take him to milder climes. In his 15th year, while at the Torquay, he wrote a letter in rhyme to Cummie which, notwithstanding crudities, reveals incipient descriptive powers. I have never seen this letter in print, although several transcriptions have been made. My copy is the original that was sent to the beloved nurse. It seems quite worthwhile to give it in full here. This rhyming letter's writ to thee from Glen Villa at Torquay. It is raining, plashing, pouring, and without the wind is roaring. Among the cliffs that bound the sea, and through the boughs of every tree, with an untuneful melody, not peculiar to Torquay. Oft I've heard it midst the shades of Dre's Norn's lovely wooden glades. And now again we've got it here, quite as bad as there, I fear. Imagine to yourself a hill, and then another, and one more still. Then mixed together houses white, and cliffs of a stupendous height, and just as red can be, and then a landlocked bit of sea. Mix these together with each hill, and place 3 capes beyond that still. And then you'll have the fair Torquay, that it is as near can be. But I forgot the port to add, which really is a deal too bad. Our ill luck never seems to leave us. The weather here is quite as grievous as it was in Edinburgh, which we left in such a hurry, for to try if we could find a place more suited to Ma's mind. But now the lunch has been brought in with bread and cheese and Burton's beer, so I must leave this preely letter and occupation for a better. I, being feasted, take again the ink, the paper, and the pen. So now you see I've writ to thee a letter very long, ma'am, and as this rhyme took up much time, it needed patience strong, ma'am. It's as I am ill and stay my fill in Glen Villa Meadfoot Road, which as you see will need to be till I get round again, ma'am. Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson, Glen Villa, Torquay, March 65. The superscription is Mrs. Cunningham Toryburn from Lewis. One of the most highly prized volumes in my collection is the little blue cloth book, A Child's Garden of Verses, which, it will be remembered, was dedicated by Stevenson to the woman who did so much to make his young life happy. Mine is the dedication copy, for on the title page is inscribed to Alison Cunningham from R.L.S. I have an unpublished letter written by Stevenson to his mother when the book was in preparation, which contains a paragraph that marks most emphatically his sense of gratitude and loyalty. I stick to what I said about Cummie, which was that she was the person entitled to the dedication. If I said she was the only person who would understand, it was a fashion of speaking. But to Cummie the dedication is due because she has had the most trouble and the least thanks. Echo. As for Auntie, she is my aunt, and she is a lady, and I am often decently civil to her, and I don't think I ever insulted her. 4 advantages that could not be alleged for Cummie. That was why, out of the 3 of you, I chose Cummie, and that is why I think I chose right. After several years of training in engineering, Stevenson, in his 21st, told his father of his disinclination for the pursuit and his desire to enter the profession of literature. This request was reluctantly granted with the proviso that he should at once begin the study of law, so that he might have another profession to turn to in the event of failure in the realm of letters. His biographer, Graham Balfour, has this to say of a short diary kept on a folio sheet of paper at the time the young man first entered the law office, where he was to learn conveyancing. I have printed nearly the whole of it for the sake of the contrasts. The high spirits and the sentiment, the humor and the immaturity, make a remarkable conjunction. Already it would be difficult for anyone to read it without recognizing the author, or else prognosticating for him a future which, at any rate, should be neither commonplace nor obscure. This folio sheet, now in my possession, is so significant, and is such a charming disclosure of the mind of the author in S, that I venture to print it here in full. The omissions and verbal changes of Mr. Balfour are disregarded, and the text of the manuscript meticulously adhered to. Thursday, May 9th. Went to office for first time. Had to pass an old sailor and an idiot boy, who tried both to join company with me, lest I should be late for office. A fine, sunny, breezy morning walking in. A small boy, about 10, called out Flory to a dog, was very pretty. There was a quaint little tremolo in his voice that gave it a longing that was both laughable and touching. All the rest of the way in, this voice rang in my memory and made me very happy. Friday, May 10th. Office work, copying at least, is the easiest of labor. There is just enough mind work necessary to keep you from thinking of anything else, so that one simply ceases to be a reasoning being and feels stodged and stupid about the head, a consummation devoutly to be wished for. Miss Fairfowl, girl at Wilson's, the tobacconist's, married to Monteith, a nephew of Lord Mar's, the day before yesterday. Miss F. was a good friend of mine, and I do not think she will disgrace her new what's-his-name. Sunday, May 21st. My father and I walked over Glencase to church. A fat, ruddy farm wench showed us the way, for the church, although on top of a hill, is so long buried among treetops that one does not see it till one trips against the plate. It is a quaint old building, and the minister, Mr. Torrance, his father and grandfather were here before him, is still more quaint and striking. He is about 80, and he lamed himself last summer dancing a reel at a wedding. He wears black thread gloves, and the whole manner of the man in the pulpit breathes of last century. After church, my father and I were taken to Woodhouseley to lunch by Professor Tytler. It is a very interesting old place, and the family is charmante. Monday, May 12th. In all day at the office. In the evening dined with Bob, met Catton, who was quite drunk, and spent nigh an hour in describing his wife's last hours, an infliction which he lured us to support with sherry ad lib. Splendid moonlit night, Bob walked out to Fairmile Head with me. We were both rather better than good, and in a state of mind that only comes to seldom in a lifetime. We danced and sang the whole way up the long hill without sensible fatigue. I think there was no actual conversation, at least none has remained in my memory. I recollect nothing but profuse bursts of unpremeditated song. Such a night was worth gold untold. Ave Pietesta. After we parted company at the toll, I walked on counting my money, and I noticed that the moon shone upon each individual shilling as I dropped it from one hand to the other, which made me think of that splendid passage in Keats, winding up with a joke about the poor, patient oyster. Wednesday, 22nd. At work all day at court, work being periphrasis for sitting on my behind, taking 3 luncheons and running 2 errands. In the evening, started in the rain alone, and seeing a fellow in front, I whistled him to wait till I came up. He proved to be a pit worker from Midkelder, and faute de mieux, I bribed him by the promise of ale to keep me company as far as New Petlet Inn. I heard from him that the Internationale was already on foot at Midkelder, but was not making much progress. I acquitted myself as became a child of the proletariat, and warned him quite apostolically against all connection with the abomination of desolation. He seemed much impressed and more wearied. He told me some curious stories of body snatching from the lonely little burying ground at Old Petland, and spoke with the exaggerated horror that I have always observed in common people of this very excusable misdemeanor. I was very tired of my friend before we got back again, and so I think he was of me, but I paid for the beer as he had the best of it. Friday, July 5th. A very hot, sunny day. The Princess Street gardens were full of girls and idle men, steeping themselves in the sunshine. A boy lay on the grass under a clump of gigantic hemlocks in flower that looked quite tropical, and gave the whole garden a southern smack that was intensely charming in my eyes. He was more ragged than one might conceive possible. It occurred to me that I might here play Le Dieu des pauvres gens and repeat for him that pleasure that I so often try to acquire artificially for myself by hiding money in odd corners and hopelessly trying to forget where I have laid it. So I slipped a halfpenny into his ragged waistcoat pocket. One might write whole essays about his delight at finding it. Books formerly owned by Stevenson are not easily obtained, and those that become available are quickly snatched up by collectors. In the catalogue of a New York dealer sent to me about a year ago, I found one of these rarities thus described. Stevenson's copy with autograph. 250, Antonius, the Emperor Marcus Antonius, his conversation with himself, together with the preliminary discourse of the learned Gaytaker, translated by Jeremy Collier, portrait by Van de Geer, 8-volume old calf in a full green Levant Morocco slipcase. London, 1708, $37.50. Inscribed on inside front cover, R. L. Stevenson, September 1869. A large number of passages are marked in pencil, and there are a few notes from Stevenson's library with book label signed Isabel Strong. No less than 1,000 collectors had received the catalogue as soon as I, so there was only a little chance that my order would be the first, especially as the price, in my estimation, was only a fraction of the value of this book of unusual association. I read the catalogue of an evening and telephoned early the next morning. The volume was in my hands before night. A day later I received a letter from the dealer asking whether I was satisfied to keep the book. He had received another order, doubtless many more. In the essay, Books Which Have Influenced Me, first published in his 37th year, Stevenson has this to say of the Meditations. He had then owned his copy for 18 years. The dispassionate gravity, the noble forgetfulness of self, the tenderness of others that are there expressed, and were practiced on so great a scale in the life of its writer, make this book a book quite by itself. No one can read it and not be moved. Yet it scarcely or rarely appeals to the feelings, those very mobile, those not very trusty parts of man. Its address lies farther back. Its lesson comes more deeply home. When you have read, you carry away with you a memory of the man himself. It is as though you have had touched a loyal hand, looked into brave eyes, and made a noble friend. There is another bond on you thenceforth, binding you to life and to the love of virtue. And I'm just going to pause here to show you a portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson from a painting by Sir William Blake Richmond, and this is copyrighted by the National Portrait Gallery. And I'm not sure which National Portrait Gallery that would be, perhaps the National Portrait Gallery somewhere in the United Kingdom. He carried the old tome with him to the South Seas. It bears the Vailima ticket inserted after his death in each volume of his library. The old calf binding still shines with a coat of varnish applied to the covers of all the books Stevenson had with him in his tropic home to preserve them from the ravages of insects. Stevenson and George Meredith first met in the spring of 1878. Notwithstanding the wide differences of ages, the two men immediately established a sympathetic relation. I have in my collection a letter written by the older friend, which in a few words discloses the thoughtful regard in which he held the aspiring young writer. The year date should be 1879, the common January mistake. Box Hill, Dorking, January 14th, 1878. My dear Stevenson, I wish you all good things, and best of all, good heart for work through the year. We were sorry to have missed seeing you, and supposed that Christmas would whirl you off to Edinburgh town. The Egoist is not yet out of my hands, and when it is, I doubt that those who care for my work will take to it. How much better it is to always work in the grooves. From not doing so, I find myself shunning the date of publication. The old dream of pleasure in it has long gone by. I sent Keegan Paul a poem for the first number of his N Quarterly M. He tells me he is not sure when your story will be ready, and binds me to produce him one. He can work in the same field, and I am well satisfied to think that we work together. A host of rubbishy applicants assails him already. Is the play finished? I should imagine Mr. Henley to be an excellent collaborator. Shall be glad to have the title and more to sit on the banks and thrill with your great invention. Also, I am very curious about the tour. My wife would fain hear what prisons you were taken to, and the general bearing of officials towards you. By the way, if now you are at work on everything human, know that this is not to be done without record of an oath to take the summer for idleness. I could do things had I yearly 6 months of inertness. What lights could not be seen in my vacancy, and you bear in mind that you forfeit your richness by laboring it overmuch. At your age, do nothing for ambition, nothing for money, so will your production be good and choice, while you now go on amassing treasure for the time, when a man may reasonably write for ambition, and will be too reasonable to do it. We claim you here to stay with us in the spring. Present my compliments to your father and mother. My wife and the girl and boy are well. They often speak of you. As to my work, you shall hear of it when you come. Yours ever faithfully, George Meredith. The story by Stevenson, which was not yet ready, was probably the story of a lie, which appeared in the October number of the New Magazine. The play was Deacon Brodie, rewritten from many early experiments, but not printed until 1880. The tour was Travels with a Donkey in the Genevièves. The incidents of that unusual journey were doubtless related to the amused listeners when Stevenson visited the Merediths in the following May. The book was not published until June. No wonder Meredith was curious about the tour. In the previous autumn, Stevenson had gone alone to the little mountain town of Montastier in central France. Here he spent nearly a month getting acquainted with the inhabitants, making preparations for the proposed journey, and writing articles with a view to publication. The deliberate object of the journey itself was the production of a book. The first chapter, as originally planned, was to be a description of Monastir and its people. 2 separate manuscript drafts of this sketch, each headed with the title adopted for the book, are in my possession, but neither of these trial efforts were included in the published volume. On second thought, the young writer doubtless realized that as Monastir was not a part of the actual journey, it was scarcely pertinent to devote much space to what was merely the point of departure. The longer of these early drafts formed the major portion of an article entitled A Mountain Town in France, first published in 1896 in the winter number of the Studio, accompanied by illustrations from drawings made by Stevenson himself during this sojourn. I am fortunate in having 3 cheery little letters written from Monastir to the mother of the adventurous visitor. All 3 are hitherto unpublished. September 1878. My dear mother, I suppose you are now at Buxton, but as you have not sent me your address, I cannot address except to Swanston. I am much better and in good spirits. The country is beautiful, rather too like the Highlands, but not so grand. The valley of the Gazelle below the village is my favorite spot, a winding dell of cliffs and fir woods, with here and there green meadows. The Mesnec, highest point of central France, is only a few miles from here. My company consists of 1 fellow of the Points et Chaussees, 2 excise officers, and a preceptor de contributions directes. There are sometimes horrid scenes at table. The engineer is the best. There is news. Ever your aft son, Robert Louis Stevenson. My dear mother, I heard that my father meant to give me coins for this little banishment. I am in a wager with the world to carry on my own affairs at my own expense, if I can. But if I am still to have my allowance of 25 pounds a quarter, and you would not mind giving me the heirs of 2 quarters due, 50 pounds, I own I should take that gladly, and should not feel as I had lost my wager. I am ill today, having both overworked and overwalked yesterday. The people for miles round know me and my gaiters and my cane by now. Vous rentrez au monastère, they cry as I go past. The engineer is a very nice fellow, so my meals go well, and I take a walk with him in the evening before bed. The pension is 3.5 francs, say 3 shillings a day, and the food capital, really good and plenteous, and the wine much stronger and pleasanter than most ordinaires. Besides which there is some Saint Joseph, of which I sometimes treat myself to a bottle, which is gaudy fine stuff. I like the country better almost every day, and get on with my sketching better than I could have expected. Your affectionate son, R.L.S. My dear mother, wrecked Scott's Worthies without notes. However, it is a rotten book, and not worth a rush at best. I sketch, I shoot with a revolver, I work, I take long walks. Generally, I have a good time. Above all, I'm happy to meet none but strangers. This pleases me greatly. In a little while I shall buy a donkey and set forth upon my travels to the south. Another book ought to come of it. In the meantime, I have scarce enough energy, and still too much work on my hand. I must have a clean bill before I start. Tell me about Buxton, and who my father finds to flirt with. I cannot exactly say I wish I were there with you, but indeed I am better here by myself. But I wish I wished so. Ever your affectionate son, R.L.S. What Stevenson put before us in Travels with a Donkey is really a quixotic and sentimental journey of the 19th century, a modest successor to the classic prototypes of Cervantes and Sterne. We are told that the traveler wrote the account of his little tour during the ensuing winter, but the fact is that the book was virtually written in the 12 days of the journey itself. There is now in my happy possession the journal in which Stevenson, with a fullness of detail almost marvelous when we consider the circumstances, tells the story of his adventures. This journal, revised and somewhat amplified, became the text of the book as published. In view of the unusual character of the journal, it seems to me quite worthwhile to put before the reader a few representative extracts, and to place next to them the same matters as they are related in the book. The first of these takes us to the inn at which the traveler puts up the first night. From the manuscript journal. The sleeping room was double-bedded. I had one, and I will own I was somewhat abashed to find a young man and his wife and child in the act of ensconcing themselves in the other. On y sort qui mal y pense, but I was sufficiently sophisticated to feel abashed. I kept my eyes to myself as much as I could, and I know nothing of the woman except that she had beautiful arms, full white and shapely. Whether she slept naked or not in her slip, I declare I know not. Only her arms were bare. To be thus admitted into the conjugal alcove struck me as so unaffectedly indiscreet that I sought to make peace with the husband, who took me over a cup of brandy, that he was a cooper of Valais, travelling to Saint-Étienne in search of work, and that in his spare moments he followed the fatal calling of a maker of matches. We were all tired, however, and soon slept the sleep of the traveller without fuss or afterthought. And from the book as published. The sleeping room was furnished with 2 beds. I had one, and I will own I was a little abashed to find a young man, his wife and child, in the act of mounting into the other. This was my first experience of the sort, and if I am always to feel equally silly and extraneous, I pray God it may last as well. I kept my eyes to myself and know nothing of the woman, except that she had beautiful arms and seemed no whit abashed by my appearance. As a matter of fact, the situation was more trying to me than to the pair. A pair keep each other in countenance. It is the single gentleman who has to blush. But I could not help attributing my sentiments to the husband, and sought to consolate his tolerance with a cup of brandy from my flask. He told me that he was a cooper of Valais, travelling to Saint-Étienne in search of work, and that in his spare moments he followed the fatal calling of a maker of matches. Me he readily enough divined to be a brandy merchant. Next we have the succinct description of the village of Florac, from the manuscript journal. Florac itself, seated among its hills, is as perfect a little town as one could desire to see, with its old castle, its fountain welling from the cleft basin of the hills, its alley of plains, its rugged street corners, and infinity of bridges. From the book as published. On a branch of the Tarn stands Florac, the seat of a sub-prefecture, with an old castle, an alley of plains, many quaint street corners, and a live fountain welling from the hill. It is notable besides for handsome women, and is one of the 2 capitals, Alais being the other of the country, one of the 2 capitals rather, Alais being the other of the country of the Camisards. The contrasted accounts of a camp at night are particularly typical examples of the similarities and differences of the two texts. From the manuscript journal. A little hollow underneath the oak was my bed. Before I had fed Modestine and arranged my sack, 3 stars were already brightly shining, and the others were dimly beginning to appear. I slipped down to the river, which looked very black among its rocks, to fill my can, and then dined with a good appetite in the dark, for I scrupled to light my lantern in the near neighborhood of a house, and thereafter lay and smoked a cigarette. The moon, which I had seen a pallid crescent all afternoon, faintly illuminated the summits of the hills, but not a ray fell where I lay. The oak rose before me like a pillar of blackness, and overhead the heartsome stars were set in the face of the night. Peace fell from them upon my spirit like a dew. No one knows what a spell they exercise who has not slept afield, slept, as the French happily put it, à la belle étoile. There is no reason why a man's eyes should love to behold these faraway worlds, sprinkled like tapers or shaken together like a silver mist upon the sky, or no more at least than why he should love his children, or be ready to give his life for a woman. It is one of the brute facts of human nature, a coolness of the spirit, a content, a quiet gladness comes from their contemplation, and all ill humors vanish from the soul. And here we have from the book as published. A hollow underneath the oak was my bed. Before I had fed Modestine and arranged my sack, 3 stars were already brightly shining, and the others were beginning dimly to appear. I slipped down to the river, which looked very black among its rocks, to fill my can, and dined with a good appetite in the dark, for I scrupled to light a lantern while so near a house. The moon, which I had seen a pallid crescent all afternoon, faintly illuminated the summit of the hills, but not a ray fell on the bottoms of the glen where I was lying. The oak rose before me like a pillar of darkness, and overhead the heartsome stars were set in the face of the night. No one knows the stars who has not slept, as the French happily put it, à la belle étoile. He may know all their names and distances and magnitudes, and yet be ignorant of what alone concerns mankind, their serene and gladsome influence on the mind. The greater part of poetry is about the stars, and very justly, for they are themselves the most classical way of poets. These same faraway worlds, sprinkled like tapers or shaken together like a diamond dust upon the sky, had looked not otherwise to Roland or Cavalier, when, in the words of the latter, they had no other tent but the sky, and no other bed than my mother earth. Well, in the published book, we find the author has added several paragraphs relating to the history of the region traversed, and various reflections. There are in the journal many lines that are not included in the printed text. Among the most notable of these omissions are three little prayers which appear in connection with the incidental visit to Our Lady of the Snows, and were doubtless the expression of thoughts inspired by the atmosphere of monastery and intercourse with the devout brethren. The trio is given here with a few prefatory lines from the journal, also hitherto unpublished. Apart from all other considerations, the thought of this perpetual succession of prayers made the time seem pleasant to me in the monastery of Our L of the S. I have, like other people of my own, thoughts about prayer. I find some prayers among the noblest reading in the world. Often when I am alone, I find a pleasure in making them for myself, as one would make a sonnet. I share but cannot approve the superstition that a man may change by his supplications the course of the seasons or the linked events of life. I have prayed in my day, like others, for wicked, foolish, or senseless alterations in the scheme of things, but these grasping complaints are not a prayer. It is in prayer that a man resumes his attitude towards God and the world. The thought of his heart comes out of him clean and simple. He takes, in Shakespeare's language, a new acquaintance of himself, and makes of that a new point of departure in belief and conduct. As I walked beside my donkey on this voyage, I made a prayer to myself, which I here offer to the reader as I offer him any other thought that springs up in me by the way. A voyage is a piece of autobiography at best. A prayer. O God, who givest us day by day the support of thy kindly countenance and hopeful spirit among the manifold temptations and adventures of this life, Having brought us thus far, do not, O God, desert us, but with thy continued favors follow us in our path. Keep us upright and humble, and O thou who equally guidest all mankind through sun and rain, give us thy spirit of great mercy. A prayer for mind and body. Give us peace of mind in our day, O Lord, and sufficiency for bodily comfort, that we be not tortured with changing friendships or opinions, nor crucified by disease, but ever in strength, constancy, and pleasantness walk in a fair way before thy face, and in the sight of men. And if it please thee, O Lord, take us soon in health of mind and honor of body into thy eternal rest. And here we have a facsimile of a prayer of mind and body. A prayer for friends. God, who hast given us the love of women and the friendship of men, keep alive in our hearts the sense of old fellowship and tenderness. Make offenses to be forgotten and services remembered. Protect those whom we love in all things, and follow them with kindness, so that they may lead simple and unsuffering lives, and in the end die easily with quiet minds. On 2 of the front leaves of the book, which was used by Stevenson for the daily record of his travels, is a closely written sketch in very small handwriting, bearing the title, To the Pentland Hills. This is an early draft of a chapter of Edinburgh Picturesque Notes. The anecdote of the Gauger, which concludes the manuscript, is undoubtedly the genius of one of the 3 poems written on several back pages of the same book. In the manuscript, the title, The Gauger's Flute, this, on publication, was changed to A Song of the Road. The first stanza will recall to many the lilting lines of the poem. The gauger walked with willing foot, and I, the gauger, played the flute. And what should Master Gauger play, but o'er the hills and far away? And in a note here, Stevenson was not an accurate speller. The word gauger is always Gauger, Guager, in the manuscript of both anecdote and poem. The inciting anecdote, the inciting anecdote is here printed from the manuscript. The text was revised when published. And here we have facsimile reproduction of that. Down below, upon a stream, the road passes Bow Bridge, now a dairy farm, but once a distillery of whiskey. It chanced in the last century that a distiller was on terms of good fellowship with the visiting officer of excise. This latter was a man of an easy, friendly disposition, and a master of convivial accomplishments. Every now and again he walked out of Edinburgh to measure his friend's stock. It was a double-faced predicament, agreeable enough when one's business led one in a friend's direction, but painful to be the cause of loss to a host. Accordingly, when he got to the level of Fair Milehead, the gauger would take his flute, without which he never travelled, from his pocket, fit it together, and, as if inspired by the beauty of the neighbourhood, proceed to play a certain air as hard as ever he could. At the first note, the distiller pricked his ears. A flute at Fair Milehead? And playing over the hills and far away, it was his friend, the gauger. Instantly a horse was put to, and sundry barrels were got up upon a cart, and driven furiously round by Hill End, and concealed in the mossy glen behind Kirk Yetton. At the same time, you may be sure, a fat fowl was put to the fire, and the best napery brought out. A little after, the gauger, having had his fill of music for the moment, walked down with the most innocent air, and found the good people at Bow Bridge taken entirely unaware by his arrival, but none the less glad to see him. In the evening, the gauger's flute and the distiller's liquors would combine to pass the rosy hours, and I dare say, when both were a little mellow, the proceedings would terminate with Over the Hills and Far Away, to an accompaniment of knowing glances. Another of the poems, which follow the manuscript of the Travels, has for title the name of the young peasant, who, without military training, but with a genius for war, was chosen brigadier of the Camisards at 17. The romantic career of John Cavalier readily appealed to Stevenson, who himself would have loved the life of a guerrilla. In fact, his interest was so aroused that he contemplated writing a story based on the marvelous life of the young hero. The reader of Travels with a Donkey will recall the allusions to the bloody battles of the rebellious mountaineers with the soldiers of the king, but here, for the first time, he may read the poem written by Stevenson while in the very country of the intrepid Camisards, who fought the fight of faith in those intricate hills more than 2 centuries ago. John Cavalier. These are your hills, John Cavalier, your father's kids you tended here, and grew among these mountains wild, a humble and religious child. Fate turned the wheel, you grew and grew, bold marshals doffed the hat to you, God whispered counsels in your ear to guide your sallies, Cavalier. You shook the earth with martial tread, the ensigns fluttered by your head, in Spain or France or Valais or Kent, the music sounded as you went. Much would I give if I might spy your brave battalions marching by, or on the wind if I might hear your drums and bugles, Cavalier. In vain o'er the windy hill, the ways are void, the air is still. Alone below the echoing rock, the shepherds calls upon their flock. The wars of Spain and of Savines, the bugles and the marching men, the horse you rode for many years, where are they now, John Cavalier? All armies march the selfsame way, far from the cheerful eye of day, and you and yours marched down below about 200 years ago. Over the hills into the shade, journeys each mortal cavalcade, one of the sound, out of the sun. Out of the sound, out of the sun, they go when their day's work is done, and all shall doff the bandolier to sleep with dead John Cavalier. The third poem from the same source, as characteristic of the author as any of his pen, has also remained unpublished until now. Praise and Prayer. I have been well, I have been ill, I have been rich and poor, I have set my back against the wall and fought it by the hour. I have been false, I have been true, and though grief and mirth have done all that man can do to be a man of worth, and now, when from an unknown shore I dare an unknown wave, God who has helped me herefore too, oh help me with the lave monastier. And here we have a facsimile reproduction of that poem as well. In the course of a few years, several editions of the Travels with a Donkey were called for by a public gradually awakening to the charm of a new writer. We must now take leave of Modestine with his note of the author to his publishers. Messrs. R. and R. Clark, dear sirs, what has become of me and my donkey? She was never a fast traveller, but she has taken longer to come through Hanover Street than the cross Gévaudan. There must be carrots in your office. Please see to it and let me hear. Yours truly, Robert Louis Stevenson. I have been more than fortunate in obtaining original manuscripts of Stevenson poems. No less than 10 of these contained in the first edition of Underwoods are in my collection. There is no material difference between the text of these manuscripts and that of the poems as published, except in the Envoy and Requiem. The Envoy was written at Bournemouth, and Stevenson in the little verse was describing in The Wish to All his own home there. Scaravore, which Thomas Stevenson had bought as a gift for his daughter-in-law. In this, its original form, the poem has 2 extra lines, the third and the fourth. And there we have a facsimile of that poem. Go, little book, and wish to all flowers in the garden, meet in the hall, an active conscience, honor life, a tender and a laughing wife, a bin of wine, a spice of wit, a house with lawns enclosing it, a living river by the door, a nightingale in the sycamore. The Requiem by general verdict, Stevenson's poetical masterpiece, has in the manuscript an extra stanza placed between the 2 ever-familiar verses. And here we have a facsimile of that. Requiem. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. Here may the winds about me blow, here the clouds may come and go, here shall be rest for evermore, and the heart for aye shall be still. This be the verse you grave for me, here he lies where he longed to be. Here is the sailor home from sea, and the hunter home from the hill. I have as well manuscripts of 8 more poems, most of them written in the South Seas, and I am also fortunate in the possession of a folio book, used by Stevenson for experiments in poetry. Here are scores of poems in the making, together with several quite complete altogether, a manuscript volume to be treasured for all time. Several years after the death of Stevenson, his wife sent to Dodd and Livingston of New York City to be sold for her account the title page and first 10 chapters of the original manuscript of Kidnapped, comprising 62 folio leaves. I bought them. A few years later, I obtained from the same source the manuscript of chapters 11 to 26 inclusive, and all but the last leaf of chapter 27, comprising 101 folio leaves. Later still, a thorough search was made for the missing leaf in the last 3 chapters. Only the single leaf was found. This I have. No trace of the missing chapters has been discovered, but my collecting luck has been so remarkably good that I still have hopes of some day receiving an almost magic letter telling me how these lacking sheets were mislaid, perhaps by the printer, and offering them to me. It is needless to say that I stand ready to show my most generous appreciation if, in this or in any other way, I am put in a position to complete the manuscript. Stevenson himself says of Kidnapped, "In one of my books, and in one only, the characters took the bit in their teeth all at once. They became detached from the flat paper. They turned their back on me and walked off boldly. And from that time my task was stenographic. It was they who spoke, it was they who wrote the remainder of the story." There is a letter in my collection, written when the story was all but completed, which has already been printed in part. It is surely worthwhile to give it here in full, omitting only inconsequential postscripts, so as to farther emphasize the author's own opinion of the tale. The letter is without place, but was undoubtedly written at Bournemouth. January 25th, 1886. My dear Father, many thanks for a letter quite like yourself. I quite agree with you and had already planned a scene of religion in D. Belfer, the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. The Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge furnishes me with a catechist, whom I shall try to make the man. I have another catechist, the blind, pistol-carrying highway robber, whom I have transferred from the Long Island to Mull. I find it a picturesque period, and wonder Scott let it escape. The Covenant is lost on one of the Terrans, and David is cast on Iriad, where, being from inland, he is nearly starved before he finds out the island is tidal. Then he crosses Mull to Torresay, meeting the blind catechist by the way, then crosses Morven from Kinlochen to Kinnagerloch, where he stays the night with the good catechist. That is where I am. Next day he is to be put ashore in Appin, and be present at Colin Campbell's death. Today I rest, being a little run down. Strange how liable we are to brain fag in this society family. But as far as I have got all but the last chapter, I think David is on his feet, and to my mind a far better story and far sounder at heart than Treasure Island. I have no earthly news, living entirely in my story, and only coming out of it to play patience. The Shelleys are gone, the Taylors kinder than can be imagined. The other day Lady Taylor drove over and called on me. She is a delightful old lady and great fun. I mentioned a story about the Duchess of Wellington, which I had heard Sir Henry tell, and though he was very tired, he looked it up and copied it out for me in his own hand. The Vandergrifter is pretty Vandergrifty. I am well only for this touch of overwork which annoys me, but does me no other harm, I think. I do trust Bath may do the trick, but I suspect the great thing is rest. Mind your allowance, stick to that if you are too tired. Go to bed. Don't call in the aid of the enemy, for as long as you are in this state an enemy, it is, and a dangerous one. Believe me, ever your affectionate son, Robert Louis Stevenson. In another published letter, also in my collection, which was written to his father shortly after the book was issued, Stevenson makes his happy forecast. David seems really to be going to succeed, which is a pleasant prospect on all sides. I am, I believe, floated financially. A book that sells will be a pleasant novelty. I enclose another review, mighty complimentary, and calculated to sell the book too. Let me remind the reader that David and Alan, within sight of their goal, turned back after the unsuccessful attempt to pass the sentry at the Bridge of Forth. They stopped at a small inn in Limekilns, and bought bread and cheese from the good-looking maid in charge. They departed, but a little later returned to the inn, and Alan then, by a bit of excusable deception, so worked on the sympathies of the susceptible lass that she promised to find means to put them over the water to Queensferry. In the book as published, the intrepid girl who brought the refugees to safety is not mentioned by name. That Stevenson had intended definitely to identify her is disclosed in a few cancelled lines of the manuscript. To make a long story short, she was as good as her word, and about 11 of the clock came by herself in a boat and set us across near Carridon. Her name, she said, was Alison Hasty. She would have none of ours, though I offered to tell her mine, and having shown herself in all things a very good friend to us, she shook us by the hand and got again into her boat for the return. When I acquired the second batch of the manuscript, I found with it a folio leaf containing a note to Kidnapped, incomplete but very interesting as far as it goes. It is here first printed. Note to Kidnapped. I have prepared myself, or begun to prepare myself, for several works of history. The mountains were repeatedly in travail, and mice in the shape of little storybooks were the best of my results. The best of all my designs, a history of the Highlands from the Union to the present day, social, literary, economical, and religious, embracing the 15th and the 45th, the collapse of the clan system, and the causes and the growth of existing discontents, I bequeath myself to a more qualified successor. I was myself debarred by the difficulties of the Gaelic language and the state of my health, which made me an exile from my native country. But I desisted with regret, having grown more and more convinced of the utility and interest of the work. It was in the course of these Highland studies that I bought in the city of Inverness the printed trial of James Stewart, bound up with a critical examination of the evidence. I suppose the volume cost me a few shillings, and has proved certainly the best of my investments. I was taken from the tale from the beginning, so no one is so dull. I was taken with the tale from the beginning, no one so dull, but must have been struck with the picturesque details. No one at all acquainted with the Highlands, but must have recognized in this tragedy something highly typical of the place and time. Agrarian crime in Scotland had a colour of antique and disinterested virtue. It was in the cause of the exiled chief, not of the tenant. It was for another, not for himself, that the murder acted. Hence a part of the pleasure with which I considered this old trial. Hence I determined to found upon it a narration of fact, and hence, in order to make certain of my local colour, I visited Appin in the early summer of 1880. It was the last of many journeys with my father. It was the first time I had travelled with him, since we were at all on a footing of equality. The weather was very wild. We were confined whole days to the inn parlour, at Glencory, at Oban, and elsewhere. But the time sped with that delightful comrade. I have rarely been well received among strangers, never if they were womenfolk, and I recall how pleased and amused me to be a sharer in my father's popularity, and in the public sitting rooms to be the centre of delighted groups of girls. The stormy and tender old man with a noble mouth and great luminous eyes had almost to the end so great a gift of pleasing. At Balachurlish we had no difficulty in finding the cairn that still marks the place of death, and when we inquired after. As the reader knows, this article for the most part is Stevenson's own writing. In fact, there is so much by Stevenson, and so little by William Harris Arnold, that some may say, why put your name to it at all? I don't want to go that extreme, for I do desire recognition for bringing to light a considerable body of original Stevenson material, hitherto unpublished, which can now receive the attention it deserves. And that brings us to the end of that chapter on Robert Louis Stevenson. And there is one chapter, chapter 10, left in this book, and Sean D. Standfast will be reading that this coming Sunday. If you've sat through all these chapters, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for joining both of us on this read-aloud journey through William Harris Arnold's Ventures in Book Collecting.